Welcome back to the Rules of Engagement. We're about to jump into analyzing the series between Roro and Hero. But before we get into that, let's talk about a couple future job opportunities. So maybe you want to be a sniper and be like Kerrigan shooting giant cockroaches in the future. But maybe you want to do something a little bit less hazardous, get into designing things that look like a Kerrigan shooting a giant cockroach. If you're interested in that, being part of what makes great video games like Starcraft 2, League of Legends, Call of Duty exist, check out some opportunities at www.fullsail.edu/MLG. Just very brief form, you fill out basically what you're interested in, and they'll give you some information about the different academic programs they offer. That being said, let's jump into our next game, which is going to be Roro versus Hero. We're going to jump straight into Game 2. So actually, let's talk about a little bit of things we're going to talk about. First, it's going to be Game 2. Then we'll go over Game 3 and then Game 4. This was a pretty long series, so I don't have time to analyze every single game, but we'll take a couple of ones that I found were most interesting. Then at the end of this, after Game 4, we'll do a series overview, talk a little about what happened, and then, of course, questions and answers. So if you have any questions, submit them to me by tweeting to me at axslav. End of the show, all those many of the questions will be answered, maybe not every single one, depending on the quantity. We'll do some questions and answers, though. Let's jump into the first game. Roro vs. Hero, Game 2 on Daybreak. It's going to be about mutalisks play versus Protoss. But before that, it's going to be talking about how to play against an air opening as a Zerg player and making sure you can defend against that. We saw Fantasy really struggled against that Voider Olin and then the Oracle Harass. Can Roro, using the Zerg, do any better? Then we're going to talk about how to transition to mutalisks and then also how to utilize those mutalisks in Zerg versus Protoss. So, jumping into the first replay, game number 2. At this point, Hero is up 1-0. So, Roro's on the back foot here. And when you play against an air opening, so Roro has... I don't know if he's identified it here yet. I think he has. Yeah, he sent an overword in... Or no, he hasn't yet. So... Sorry, I keep making a mistake. I jumped in. He's already identified the air opening with an Overlord scout. Of course, Overlord died. Phoenix has got those kills. They've been killing Overlords. Now, one thing is it's important to defend to make sure you're safe from those airborne threats. Get your Spore Cars. Get your Queens everywhere. But the other thing to note, he's getting 14 Zerglings over here. Why is he getting 14 Zerglings? Well, because not only is it important to make sure you're safe from the air threats with your Queens by your Spores, Overlords by your Spores. There's a Spore right underneath those Overlords. And, of course, everywhere. Spores everywhere. Just one in each base. An extra one if you want somewhere. But also, if your opponent is building air units, they'll be weaker on the ground. Look at this. 930 mark. What does Protoss have on the ground? Well, he's got 1 Stalker and 1 Sentry. That's not a very scary ground force. So, what you want to do is you want to get a couple, some small ground army like these Speedings here. And the point of these is to make sure your opponent can't take an expansion. Because no matter what, how good your defense is against a top-level Protoss like Hero, what's going to happen is you're going to take some damage. Maybe this 731 could be a smaller number if you did some things a little bit better, if Roro was a little more on top of things. But regardless of what type of number it is, it's going to be a bigger number than the Protoss loss is if they're opening air, because air can be very efficient against Zerg in the early game. If they're good at controlling it, they shouldn't lose anything. But your advantage is you got 3 bases, and because the ground army is weak, you can usually ensure that they have to wait a little bit more into the game before they can take their 3rd base. Canceling it, delaying it, anything like that really gives you that big favor, because look at the economy. You're getting more economy. So sure, you've lost more resources than them, but you know what? Every minute that passes, you're mining more minerals that can mitigate that difference. So the next thing we want to talk about is when to transition to mutalisks. So we can see here, Roro open with Roaches and Hydras. Of course, you don't want to use mutalisks against Phoenixes straight up, unless you have overwhelming numbers. But if he's opening with Hydras and Roaches, and then he notices, you know what? I lost my Zerglings. I can tell he's setting up a wall, right? These Zerglings just saw the wall. I can tell he's going to have Time Warps. He's going to have Force Fields. He's got a Colossus out already. You know what? I'm going to be unable to force a decisive engagement. And as the game goes on, because I'm stuck with Roaches and Hydras, I'm going to have a weaker army as the game goes on. And that's not going to be good either. So in this case, where you're stuck on Roaches and Hydras, and then the game goes on, you're going to have a weaker army. you want to go for mobility-based units instead of power units. Power units being, you know, more roaches, hydra, basic units that just sit there and fight, and that's what they do. You already know as the game goes on, your army's going to be weaker because they're stuck on roaches and hydras. So you go for mobility play to make this investment, you know, not matter as much. The power is not as important. So that's why it's so great to transition to mutalisks in this circumstance. When you're stuck with an okay army now, but you know as the game goes on, you're not going to match up this Protoss force because instead of getting those infestors, swarm hosts, Broodlord tech, you made those roaches and hydras. So as you're going to mutalisks, one thing that's really cool is you want to constantly change from spreading your army out into 2 groups, 1 group here and 2 groups here, and attacking multiple locations. You see the mutalisks draw the army down, and then this army can come in and attack the natural. You use that, but then you also concentrate your forces occasionally and attack 1 location. And by doing this, by first spreading out, attacking multiple targets, and now your opponent's like, oh no, I have to go and defend my expansion, right? And then later, you group up and you concentrate. It makes it very, very hard to defend. As we can see here, Roro is doing, first he's spreading his opponent out. Now his opponent is starting to accommodate for that, to take that into consideration by splitting up their army. Hero's going to need some stalkers here to cover the mutalisks. Make sure he's got units here to cover the 3rd base as well. Basically cover everywhere. And so as soon as your opponent splits their units up to cover multiple locations, then you all of a sudden you mass up, you concentrate, and when you're concentrated and your opponent's split up, right, this army here, it can't go in and defend this army. It's just too much. He's got to wait to do a good engagement until all these units come back too. So you can rotate between concentrating forces and splitting up forces as a great way to make it very hard for your opponent to defend. If their defense is spread out, you concentrate on 1 target. If their defense is all at 1 target, you just spread out and attack someplace else. Makes it very, very difficult to defend. So as we see here, we're actually going to jump back a little bit and talk about the way he approached this type of concept. Now let me fast forward to the next section. So at first, he knows he's going to be behind an army strength because he's stuck on roaches and hydralisks as opposed to an opponent who has colossi and blinkstalkers. So one thing that he does is talking about his unit spread, right? He's got the roaches and hydralisks right here, RH. And at this moment in time, his mutalisks are right around here, and they're spread out, right? And so his mutalisks are going to come around and hit this location, and the roaches and hydralisks are going to hit this one. And now, as a Protoss opponent, right, what is your Protoss opponent going to do? Well, they're going to basically try to cover both the areas. So they're going to send some units. Let's say right now they have their army here, right? They're going to send half these units down here and half the units up here, right? And then what's the end result of that? Well, the end result of that is they have a new army positioning, and it's going to be a small group of units here and a small group of units here. And then how do you take advantage of that? You do exactly what I was saying. You change tactics. Instead of spreading hitting multiple locations, you've got your speeding reinforcements. They're going to get up here. Your mutalisks, after they hit here, are going to come back here. And then they're going to come in here, and you're going to wipe this army out, right? Now, Hero, being a very good Protoss player, recognizes that that's a problem. And so he pulls this army back here. And that way, if this army's attacked, he can group up with both his forces. But of course, as soon as he does that, that leaves this vulnerable, and that basically get knocked out, which is exactly what Roro did with his movements here. He knows that as soon as he does that, first he attacks both locations. Then when Hero splits his army up, right? He's got half his army up here, half his army down here, basically protecting wherever the mutalisks are going to go. Meanwhile, the speeding reinforcements are coming across the map. They're massing up top here. And now, if he had this army right here, positioned here, like I was saying, what would happen? Well, he's got 3 Colossi and 5 Stalkers, right? I mean, this amount of mutalisks would just focus on the Colossi. Then the Zergans would run in and kill everything else. Not to mention, there's bajillions of Zergans crossing the map. So Hero, knowing that there's a threat that he doesn't want to keep his armies too far apart, instead what he does is he keeps it here where it's close to reinforce, but that leaves his 3rd base vulnerable, and of course it's going to get focused down. And from this point on, all Roro has to do is just play a solid game. He's at 40 food, 5 bases to, 5 bases at least of gas, not utilizing the minerals, but 5 bases to a measly 2, and the game is his from there, and he goes on to win that game. Using a couple important principles. One, making sure if your opponent's going air, not only do you defend, but you deny them from taking an early third base because their ground army is too weak to really defend that base early on. Then, you know that if you're stuck on roaches and hydras, but because of the way your opponent has played a strong defensive game, you cannot force a decisive engagement, you need to transition to mobility play. If you try to transition to a power play, those roaches and hydras have slowed your tech transition, and they're watering down your army strength, and you're just going to end up in a weaker late game. So go for that mobility play instead. I mean, sometimes you can still make it to Broodlords, but it's a little bit riskier as opposed to going straight to those Broodlords. And then, of course, lastly, when you're using Mutalisks, constantly change the tactics from concentrating on one objective to splitting up and attacking everywhere. Doing this will confuse the defending player, make it very hard for him to both cover everywhere with defense, but also cover each place with enough defense to meet whatever threat is at hand. That wraps it up for game number 2. We'll take a short break and be right back analyzing game number 3 between Roro and Hero.